All right, you have fairly recently published new proposals for wilder riverbanks. Just be good to understand, I guess, a little bit of the background as to, why you thought it was necessary to produce those.
Yes, absolutely. So the Wildlife Trust published our proposal fairly recently, recognising that there's a time of quite a lot of shift in water policy, a good opportunity to highlight the things that we think needs to happen. And our Wilder Riverbanks proposal really puts restoring natural habitat at the heart of plans to tackle the poor state of our rivers. We know that there are many, many pressures affecting our rivers, but quite central to some of the issues that they are facing are the risks of pollution, the impacts of pollution, and also the need for action for wildlife. And so Wilder Riverbanks really brings both of these issues together, tackling those problems as well as being able to deliver multiple other benefits at the same time.
Okay, and when it comes to the current state of the UK's rivers, I guess we're all probably familiar with the headlines, and the water companies have been particularly sort of castigated for allowing pollution in storm overflows, etc. So I guess everyone knows about that. But what else is going on? Are there other contributing factors to the state? I guess, yeah, the state of the rivers. Give us a bit more about that, and then what has caused it? Has it just been neglect, or actively people sort of polluting it for whatever reason? Just give us a sort of overview if you can.
Yes, it is a quite unpleasant and complicated picture. So, as you said, we all know the headlines. We know that across England, none of our waters are meeting chemical targets, and very, very few are meeting ecological targets. We only have around 16% in good ecological status. And interestingly, it's a similar picture across other parts of the EU as well. So we all operate under the same framework that came originally from an EU directive, the Water Framework Directive. And so we're all operating under a similar regime towards similar targets. And many other European nations are also far away from meeting the targets that they have set up for themselves. In England, we have an ambition to bring 78% of our waters to good status, and we're about 16 at the moment for ecological and 0 for chemical. So we're a long way away from that ambition. And multiple reasons for this, and that's one of the reasons it's so difficult to make progress and to tackle the state of our waters, is that there are so many pressures facing them. So we all know that wastewater is an issue. Sewage is something that's been in the headlines practically constantly for the last couple of years. And those kind of sewage spills, the storm overflows of untreated wastewater getting into the environment is very headline catching. But there are other pressures that come from the water industry, including even treated wastewater that comes out of our wastewater treatment works is still very high in nutrients, and that's a real problem for the ecology of our rivers and our coasts. And abstraction is also an issue, taking too much water out of our environment to meet public supply needs. And so the water sector is responsible for a significant amount of the pressures that are facing our water environment. But it may surprise many to hear that actually farming is a more significant sector in terms of the problems it causes for our water environment. And the recent Independent Water Commission, the Cunliffe Review, identified that agriculture has the most significant environmental impact on water bodies in England and Wales. So it's a sector responsible for pressures, particularly from nutrient pollution, from soil runoff, from fertilizers, from manure running into our waterways, as well as other things like agricultural chemicals. So the water sector and the farming sector are some of the big problems that our waters are facing, but also a host of other issues as well. We have the sort of physical habitat of our waterways. We've very heavily modified that over time for things like navigation, milling, flood defences. So our waterways don't function naturally, and that causes huge problems for the wildlife that lives there, and also for the management of flows. We see problems that relate to flooding, with flooding causing erosion, causing the spread of invasive species. We have problems with chemical pollution. As I said, none of our waters are meeting their chemical standards. And this is a virtue of all of the chemicals that we use in society, in farming, in industry, that run off our lands, that run from our towns and cities, that leach out of landfill sites. So there's a whole host of issues that are facing our waters. And this has been a growing area of public concern and even outrage in recent years, which has really helped to sort of shine a light on all of these problems that our waters are facing and start to drive a bit more government focus on what the solutions need to be. And I think there are again a host of issues that have sort of contributed to these problems. We have certainly seen insufficient investment historically in improving our waterways. We've also seen regulators that have been hampered by weak or confusing or contradictory rules and a lack of funding for monitoring, a lack of staff. There are a whole host of sort of complications around responsibility. So who exactly has responsibility for what and how do they interrelate? So a whole host of issues that have led to these pressures not being sufficiently tackled in the past. In terms of going forward, one of the key things is the need for integrated action. So looking at the pressures across the whole suite of sectors that are impacting our waters, and also thinking, because some of these solutions are really long term, really expensive. So what can we do to take action in the interim, and what can we do to deliver the solutions in a more effective way? So thinking about all of the multiple benefits that they could deliver and sort of picking the best value options going forward. So yeah, it's a complicated and not very positive picture currently, but significant scope to do things differently going forward.
Yeah, and as say the focus of, I think you mentioned earlier, is on prioritizing the restoration of natural habitats. So, how do you turn that sort of objective into sort of actions which will, bring the benefits that people will, I guess, I guess until people notice it, and obviously the wildlife itself is thriving again, or in a safer environment. Just your thoughts as to how that comes about, I suppose.
Yeah, the way I suppose we can think of habitats along our waterways at the moment, because there are some great pockets of habitat, but they are just that, they're sort of isolated pockets, and I like to think of them as sort of a series of beads along a necklace. They're great things to have, but they're not really a connected, extensive swathe of habitat. And that creates problems for the species that live there, because those isolated pockets can be quite vulnerable to things like pollution or habitat destruction or harm through development or whatever else the pressures might be. So those sites are vulnerable. And also in the areas where we don't have that habitat, where that habitat is lacking, that's where we see a lot of the problems impacting our rivers. So it's where we can see the soil, the agricultural chemicals, the nutrients from manure, and the pollutants from our urban areas washing into those waterways. We also see that those sites they're very exposed, where we don't have natural habitat, exposed to sunlight, and that's a real issue with climate change. So we can see our rivers heating up to the kinds of temperatures where it's really problematic for aquatic insects and for fish, and sometimes even fatal. So this absence of nature-rich habitat along our rivers is really significant. And so where we do have this wilder land, where we can create this wilder land around our rivers, it creates a much stronger barrier against pollution washing in from the surrounding landscape, but it also creates real opportunities for nature. And if we could create a connected corridor along our waterways, then that creates huge opportunities for species that are currently really struggling, like otter and waterfowl, to really sort of thrive and re-establish across areas where they used to be common. And if you think about the total length of rivers in England, it's something like 144,000 kilometres, which is a huge amount. So imagine even just a few metres of nature-rich habitat either side of that. That adds up to collectively a huge area of habitat for our native species to recover and thrive.
And I guess the question in terms of you want these wilder riverbanks, what are you able to achieve, as it were, and how much are you dependent on um, engaging with other stakeholders to get them on board with the objective?
Well, wildlife trusts do own and manage land alongside rivers, so we can certainly do our part where we have that land, but often it's already in nature reserves and in sites that we've managed for nature. So those, I suppose, often contribute to those existing beads along the necklace. There is a huge variety of land ownership across our river system, so we're very much in need to work in partnership with other landowners, other organisations to achieve this. And we think that one of the key opportunities here really is that to create these new sort of nature-rich swathes along our watercourses could provide a real opportunity for new sources of income for farmers. So through things like agri-environment schemes or other nature markets, it can be a really good opportunity to diversify the income for the farming community. We also think there are great opportunities for these nature-rich corridors to help in protection against flooding, and so sources of funding related to flood management could be an opportunity there as well. The Environment Agency, in a recent review of flood solutions, said that it had medium to even high confidence in all farms, all forms of habitat restoration, in helping to reduce flood risk. And for example, woodland can decrease flood risk by up to 50%. So a real opportunity to restore our riverbanks for nature, but also to provide these wider benefits like flood risk reduction at the same time. And we know that these places can also be important for carbon capture through natural habitats and through providing things like public access for public health and well-being. So these wilder riverbanks are really important to deliver a whole host of benefits from which society can draw.
Okay, and linked to that sort of focus, I know you've also announced the Rivers 2040 project, and it's quite a sort of bold undertaking that you've got. I think it's an 18-month study of the River Trent. So at the highlight, we'll drill down into the particulars we're looking at, but what's the overall sort of focus and ambition of such a project?
Yeah, Rivers 2040 is a really exciting new project. So we're looking to map the benefits of river restoration across the whole system of the River Trent. As you said, it's an 18-month project involving a host of wildlife trusts, the Trent Rivers Trust and Intact Insurance. And what it's going to do is it will map and analyse the economic, but also the environmental and social benefits of restoring nature along what is England's longest river from source to sea. It's looking to put together a transformational vision for the future of the River Trent, but also to develop a blueprint for restoring all rivers in England under the same approach. I guess the sort of strapline of the project is that we need bold action that provides clean water for people and habitat for wildlife, stores water for periods of drought, and protects homes and businesses for flooding. So it's really about the multifunctionality of our river systems and our river corridors and how we can best achieve that in a way that meets the needs of nature and of local communities at the same time.
And in terms of some of the specifics, I think one of the high level ones is you want to look at the opportunity for nature-based solutions. I think you obviously mentioned some of those in the sort of earlier topic about the wild, but tell us what's the sort of scope of opportunity there.
Nature-based solutions will definitely be a focus in our thinking, and we see these solutions as a means of meeting the societal challenges that we face in a way that also delivers for nature and for the environment more widely. And we think that one of the big opportunities when it comes to river systems is that of natural flood management. So using solutions that will slow the flow of rainwater and stop it getting into our rivers and creating flood peaks that capture rainwater in the landscape and allow it to infiltrate instead of contributing to those river flows and adding to flood risk. And flood risk in England is something that is a real present concern for many people, but there are lots of communities that are at flood risk already and perhaps don't realise it, or will be at flood risk in the near future. And in England, 1 in 6 homes and businesses, so around about 6.3 million properties, are already at risk of flooding, which is, you know, a horrifyingly large number in itself already. But it's recently been predicted that that number will rise to about 8 million by the middle of the century. So that's 1 in 4 properties, a quarter of all properties in England at risk of flooding. But we think that there's significant opportunity for natural flood management and sustainable drainage solutions to really help manage that risk and mitigate that risk. And government has recently recognised this by bringing forward some changes to flood funding policy, which will make it much easier for deliverers to embark on projects involving natural flood management. So again, some really big opportunities there for the future.
Okay, and other things I think on the agenda include access to nature. So yeah, tell us a bit more about what that means.
Yeah, the project is going to be looking at a whole host of benefits or opportunities that could be delivered. And it will include flood risk, it will include thinking about drought mitigation, restoring keystone species to our landscape which have been lost, reducing pollution, providing access to nature, and integrating with the sort of policy and planning regime. So in terms of a whole host of benefits that could be delivered by river restoration. Access to nature, I think, is a really significant one from the Wildlife Trust's point of view, because we know that as a society, we have become increasingly disconnected from our natural environment. And that's harmful for 2 main reasons. One is that it's harmful to nature, because if we don't know about nature, we don't understand how important it is, we're not acting as advocates for it. So we're not there to help protect it. But the second reason is that it's also really damaging to us. So we know that we're missing out on a whole host of mental health, well-being, physical health benefits by not having access to high quality green spaces. So that's something we want to factor in to our thinking, is around how do we create and provide and maintain those access opportunities for people close to where people live, high quality habitats that provide a really enriched experience for those who visit them.
Okay, and then I think agriculture and fisheries is another focus. And again, early in the conversation, you obviously talked a little bit about the challenges, shall we say, with agriculture and runoff pollution, etc. But what else are you looking at when it comes to agriculture and fisheries? You know, what's going on there?
I think there are really big opportunities in terms of agriculture, not just directly along the river corridor, as we were talking about earlier, but across the whole farmed landscape. So if you think about a river catchment being anywhere that rainwater falls on the land and runs into that river, then any land in that catchment can have an impact on the quality of that river. So it doesn't matter if your farm is right next to the watercourse or if it's a couple of miles away, it could still be contributing to the health of the river system that you are situated within. So really big opportunities through, as I've already mentioned, agri-environment schemes, also other nature markets, looking at things like perhaps flood risk reduction or carbon credits for farmers and land managers in the catchment to think about the ways in which they could perhaps change some of the management on their land with the river system in mind. So the creation of habitats, the creation of hedgerows that stop water running off the field so quickly. There are a whole range of opportunities, from quite small things to quite really sort of large scale, landscape scale opportunities, and certainly looking at opportunities for land managers to work in partnership with their neighbours so that they're all working towards the same ambitions and therefore having greater impact. So we'll be looking at what can be done to support the health and the recovery of the river system, not just directly in the river corridor, not just in the wider floodplain, but potentially across that whole river catchments.
And on the fisheries, is there anything particular there? Because I know I'm watching again, things on television. The health, shall we say, of the fish population in our rivers is not. I don't think it's what it should be. So, shall we say? So, yeah,
Yeah.
just what's going on there.
Yes, so I think there are probably two main opportunities that we'd be thinking about here. And one is that climate change protection that I've already mentioned. So where our rivers are lacking in natural habitats, where they're very exposed to the sunlight, we see these increasing water temperatures that are really harmful for fish, and particularly salmonids, so salmon and trout, are really negatively affected by these increasing temperatures, but we know that these issues affect a whole range of other fish species as well. So looking at the opportunities to provide some shading to the river system through the creation of natural habitat. And then one of the other key issues that many of our fish species are facing is barriers to migration. So where we've put structures in the channel that either completely block them and really totally change the flow regime, or even just partially block them and change the water levels, this can make it really difficult for fish to migrate to their native breeding grounds. And every successive barrier in the channel that a fish has to struggle to get past really sort of zaps its energy and makes it much likely that it's going to make its way to its breeding grounds, that it's going to be able to breed and reproduce successfully. And where fish species move in and out of the river system, so the kinds of fish that spend part of their life in freshwater and part of their life in the sea, it's a real challenge for them. And you can kind of picture that, migratory fish would be impacted by these barriers in the channel. But even those fish that spend their whole life cycle in the river system, they'll often still migrate to different parts of the channel at different parts of their life cycle. So even those can be affected by these barriers in the river. So we'll be thinking about the opportunities to potentially remove, to modify, or to bypass some of these structures so that not only fish can have an easier ride up and down the channel, but also other species that need to move up and down the river system as part of their life cycle. So aquatic invertebrates and other aquatic species can also benefit from having better access to different parts of the river system.
Okay, and then maybe just a couple of other things. I know there's I guess it's fairly specific to the Trent, though maybe in other places there's the aggregate extraction you're going to look at, and then I think more generally, and you probably sort of been covering it as we've gone along, but if there's anything else you want to say about specifically protecting wildlife habitats.
On aggregates, yes. As you say, this won't be relevant to every area of the country, but certainly in the Trent, it's something that has shaped the landscape. And so we'll look at, if there are areas which really need to be retained as they are or enhanced and protected against future aggregate abstraction, but also thinking about what are the opportunities post-aggregate. So once that land has been worked, what happens on that site? Can that site be restored for nature? And there are a great number of examples across the country of sites where fantastic habitats, for example, lakes in flooded gravel pits, have been created after aggregate extraction has taken place. And so we want to think about where's the best places for future extraction to happen, but also what are the opportunities to restore those sites afterwards. And then, yes, finally, in terms of wildlife habitats and nature, we'll be thinking about the opportunities to restore keystone species. So some of our species which are threatened at the moment, or perhaps have even been lost from our countryside. And a great example is that of beavers. So we are now in a situation where we do have beavers returning to England There are some established wild populations, and there are also a number of other beaver populations in enclosures. But government has confirmed that its longer term aspiration is to restore beavers to the landscape because of the huge benefits that they can bring for the creation of wetland habitat and also the reduction of flood risk. And so we'll be thinking about whether there are opportunities to return beavers to areas of the Trent as part of our thinking, but also thinking about other species as well. And whilst, you know, beavers might get all the headlines, there are a host of other aquatic species that really have been struggling, and this could be the opportunity to really help bring them back. And one that certainly springs to mind is water vole, the UK's most rapidly declining mammal. It's been lost from something like 90% of the former sites at which it was once found, and is facing huge pressures, not only because of habitat changes, habitat loss, but also predation by the non-native American mink. So opportunities to work collaboratively at catchment scale to control mink and to create opportunities for the reintroduction or the expansion of water voles. And just like beavers, they are a sort of mini ecosystem engineer. So where they live, they modify the habitat. They're really important for things like moving plant seeds around, and they have an impact on the vegetation and therefore the structure of the riverbanks. And they are an incredibly important food source for a whole host of other species. So having them back more fully into our river landscapes is really beneficial for a number of reasons.
Okay, and in terms of how you'd characterize the River Trent today, I don't know if that's a fair question to ask, or clearly the project's going to establish that in more detail. So it may be that you say we'll know in 18 months' time. But do you have any sort of idea as to what you're faced with, at the start of the project, if you like?
We'll certainly know more as the project develops, but I think in terms of our initial understanding, I mean, there's a huge amount of data and information available already from water companies, from the Environment Agency, from Natural England. So we will bring all of that data and information together, and also from local partners on the ground. But I think how we would characterize it currently is that, as with many other rivers in the country, we do see a number of persistent pressures. There are definitely issues with pollution. We've seen those problems with lack of investment in water infrastructure in particular. We see problems with agricultural runoff, flood risk certainly, but also pressures with drought. And it can be quite surprising to people that areas of the country that are at flood risk can also be threatened by drought, but they're almost two sides of the same coin, because they're both about how we manage the landscape to manage water. And so these flood and drought pressures exist already and are expected to grow with a changing climate. We also see the sort of legacy of the industrial nature of the River Trent catchment. So, historic aggregate extraction and industry and so on. So there are lots of problems, but in places we can already see sort of glimpses of that different future. We can see areas where the rivers and the floodplains already feel quite wild, and they're home to water vole, they're home to kingfisher, beaver, otter, and these kind of wild features really help us to sort of resolve all of those other pressures. So the programme will look at what we could achieve if we took that kind of approach, if we did that kind of thing along the whole river system from source to sea.
Yeah, and as I think you mentioned earlier on, the idea is to produce a sort of blueprint for a single river catchment in terms of how it's possible to improve the whole river system. So you're going to produce obviously a report specifically on the Severn Trent, but then you're going to produce a sort of series of recommendations that you think are applicable to, all other sort of single river catchments. Just what's the sort of end goal, I suppose?
Yes, so within the project, we will be looking to establish a sort of methodology that we use for the Trent, but that could also be applied elsewhere. And in particular, this will utilise GIS mapping and economic modelling. So we'll be looking to sort of map the existing status and the potential of the whole host of ecosystem services that can be delivered by a river system. So things like water storage, carbon sequestration, recreational opportunities, and to look to identify the best locations for things like flood risk management activities, aggregate extraction, as we've talked about, nature restoration, green and blue infrastructure. So the output of our work on the Trent will come towards the end of 2026, but we see that just as the start. So after we have created that sort of vision to restore the rivers and the floodplains, then hopefully the work to actually undertake that restoration and restore natural processes and restore nature will start to take place across that river catchment. And we hope that that methodology that we establish as part of the process will be useful then to other river catchments across the country. And I don't want to claim that this is entirely something that hasn't been thought about before. There are things like this happening often at an individual sort of river catchment scale. So by that I might mean something like the River Meon down where I live in Hampshire, or small chalk streams in Norfolk, and local stakeholders come together and develop a vision and ambition for that part of the river system. I think what's new about the work that we're doing on the Trent, though, is that it's really undertaking this thinking at a much larger scale. So rather than an individual river catchment, we're thinking at sort of the whole river basin scale and thinking about how do we achieve the best outcomes for the river system by looking at that sort of macro scale.
And in terms of the sort of turning that blueprint into action, because clearly, as you say, there's a lot of different stakeholders involved. Is there a particular sort of organisation that you think needs to? I mean, is it? Bearing in mind we've had the Cunliffe report, and this government sort of is making the right noises, shall we say? Although it's clearly got many things on its plate at the moment. So, is it for government to sort of potentially take your blueprint with other work and incorporate it in some kind of national water strategy, or how do you think the work can be taken forward? As they bear in mind there are lots of stakeholders, and sometimes it's potentially they have slightly conflicting sort of priorities. So so what's the way forward there?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I do think there could be a role for government here. As you've said, there are many changes we expect coming down the line as a result of the Cunliffe Review, the Independent Water Commission. And so one of the things that's really unclear to stakeholders at the moment is where that future ambition for our water environment lies. We have the overarching targets of the Water Framework Directive, and we have in England the Environmental Improvement Plan, which do set out these ambitions for our water environment, but we know we're very far away from meeting those targets at the moment. And so one of the key things we'll be looking to government for is what is going to happen with those targets. I mean, we certainly don't want to see them weakened. We don't want to see them kicked into the long grass. So how are we going to put some emphasis behind those targets? And maybe some of the changes coming as a result of the Cunliffe Review will start to put some of those mechanisms or those opportunities in place. And certainly the Office for Environmental Protection, when it looked at our performance against the Water Framework Directive ambitions and the way that we use river basin management planning to drive forward improvements to our water environment, it very much concluded that implementation was one of the main challenges that we had not sufficiently grasped. They said that the regulations are there, the structure, the framework is sound, and we really need to think about putting that investment in place and getting that delivery on the ground undertaken. So in a new water strategy, perhaps that's something that government will be able to set out a clearer picture of, is how those how we will move towards meeting those longer term targets. And so I think I'm quite optimistic about the opportunities for things like wilder riverbanks and for the work that we're doing on the Trent to really feature in this new approach going forward from government. Some of the main conclusions of the Independent Water Commission that I think are really significant were around the need for us to think about the water environment much more holistically. So although much of the focus of the Commission's work was on the water industry specifically, Sir John in his conclusions talked about needing to think about the pressures that come from all these multiple different sectors, planning holistically, delivering holistically, thinking about the catchment scale and looking to kind of bring together and balance all of the needs and the requirements at that local level, perhaps kind of under a sort of regional umbrella, which could really help to, I think, kind of join up the sort of top-down government policy and the local level ambition and delivery by really sort of apportioning and things like targets and also things like funding at that regional level. So I think there are huge opportunities. One of the key things we'd like to see from government in a water strategy or in the white paper that we're expecting to come out before Christmas would be a commitment around nature-rich river corridors. And the Wildlife Trusts have recently joined the Making Space for Water coalition with the National Trust, the Rivers Trust, the Woodland Trust and the Beaver Trust and multiple other supporters. And we are really focused on what nature-rich river corridors can really do to help tackle these issues like the loss of nature, like agricultural pollution, and things like public access, and providing funding opportunities for farmers and land managers to help that ambition become a reality. So I'm hoping that we'll see some positive commitments of these sorts when the white paper comes out later this year.
And I have to ask, I don't want to end on a possibly downbeat, but clearly there's sort of some high profile sort of pushback against sort of climate change. And there's also, I mean, the government's, AI, for example, it's committed to that, and data centers, consuming a lot of water. Even the house building, I know ironically in some places house building is prevented because there's not enough water to supply that. But clearly if they're going to build 1.5 million, whatever it is, homes, then that happened. But do you just worry that there's this sort of pushback might water down the sort of priorities for nature and the river system, or do you think that it's possible for the government and they have a desire to sort of balance everything appropriately, shall we say?
Yeah, I do worry that it could see some really unhelpful changes when it comes to water and nature policy more widely. I mean, it's really interesting that whilst we do have this very sort of public pushback against some of these issues, I think there's a risk that we're listening to sort of, a vocal minority, because consistently when the public are asked, when surveys are undertaken, there's always a really high percentage that come out saying that they care about nature, they want more action for nature, that they want more action for climate change. And the figures don't really seem to be shifting. So whilst there is a very public pushback from some quarters on this, I don't think that's representative of what most of the public recognise and believe in. So I think we need to kind of keep that in mind as we're engaging with government over, the formation of new policy. And we've seen this very recently when it comes to things like the planning and infrastructure bill. So there's been a huge amount of opposition for clauses which people are concerned will be really damaging for nature. And we've seen pushback against the government's proposals there. And hopefully government will give some ground as the bill goes through its final stages. So yes, it is concerning, but I think it's not representative of what most of the British public value and want from our future society.
Excellent. It's been so great to chat, and thank you so much for sharing so many great insights into the work that you're doing and your thoughts on the complexity, shall we say, of the river system and more widely environmental issues. So, Ali, really appreciate your time. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.